Ever wonder how some nations navigate threats? Like, really navigate them, especially when it seems like those threats are coming from every side.
Yeah, it's a bit like walking a tightrope, isn't it?
Today, we're diving into a world where the stakes couldn't be higher, the history of targeted killings in Israel.
A topic often discussed, rarely understood.
And we're using a book that reads like a sky thriller, but it's all too real. Ronan Bergman's Rise and Kill First.
Bergman's access is insane, really. Years he spent digging into archives, getting people to talk who've never talked before.
We're talking top-level insiders from Israel's intelligence world, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, the whole shebang.
It's like peeking behind the curtain of one of the most debated, let's be honest, secretive aspects of international intelligence.
So why should this matter to, well, anyone listening?
Because understanding Israel's story, especially in the security realm, gives you a lens. A lens to view not just the Middle East, but global conflicts, how they're fought, the moral lines that get blurred.
It's not just about the tactics themselves, though, is it?
No, it's about understanding the why. Why did this tiny nation, a nation forged in conflict, and let's be frank, constantly facing existential threats?
A nation the size of New Jersey, as they
Yeah,
say.
exactly. Why did they create such a unique and some might say controversial approach to security?
So paint that picture for us. What shaped this approach?
Imagine this. You're a newly born nation surrounded by those who, shall we say, aren't thrilled about your existence.
And you're still reeling from the Holocaust, a trauma that's basically woven into your national DNA.
You're outnumbered, outgunned, but you have this fierce, almost desperate will to survive.
So what do?
You build up this incredibly effective military and intelligence network. You have to be faster, smarter, more adaptable than everyone else.
You have to fight differently.
And for Israel, a key part of that became targeted killing.
Instead of launching a full-scale war, which they might not win, they opted for something more precise.
Precise and hopefully more deterring. Imagine being a potential terrorist, knowing that if you become the leader, if you take the reins, you'll likely end up in the crosshairs. Makes you think twice.
Okay, but targeted killing, it's one of those terms thrown around a lot. How is it different from, say, just a normal military strike?
Think of a bombing raid, targeting a military base, a headquarters.
There's an acceptance of potential civilian casualties, right?
Sadly, yes. It's called collateral damage, that terrible phrase. Targeted killing, it aims to eliminate one specific person, usually a higher-ranking figure in a terrorist group or even a hostile government.
We're talking about precision elimination.
Exactly. A surgical strike, if you will.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of how this whole system evolved, let's rewind. When did this practice, this idea of targeted killing, first pop up in the region?
We have to remember, Israel as a nation-state, it's relatively young.
1948.
But this goes way back to the early 20th century during the fight for their very statehood, long before the Mossad even existed.
So who are we talking about in those early days?
Think underground Zionist militias. Groups like the Haganah, the Irgun, Lehi.
Operating in what was then British-controlled Palestine.
Right. And these groups, they were fighting for their homeland. They used whatever means necessary. Bergman gives us this example, the assassination of Jacob Dahan in 1924.
Dahan? Wasn't he Jewish himself? Why was he targeted by a Zionist group?
Dahan was a Jewish activist, yes, but he strongly opposed the creation of a Jewish state. He believed in a peaceful coexistence with Arabs, not an independent Israel. In fact, he was actually on his way to London to lobby the British government against supporting a Jewish state when he was killed.
That's a bold move, taking out someone within your own movement. Adds a whole other layer to this. What was the reaction at the time?
It was incredibly divisive. Even David Ben-Gurion, the guy who'd become Israel's first prime minister, he was dead set against it, believed it hurt the Zionist cause more than it helped.
Make them look like extremists.
Exactly, and potentially alienate allies they desperately needed.
So even back then, it wasn't just about taking out an enemy. It was about optics, about strategy.
Always. And this internal debate, this agonizing over the morality and the effectiveness of targeted killings, that would continue to play out for decades.
It's a debate that's, I imagine, more relevant than ever today.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll get into that, especially how it's evolved in the modern era. But just to give you another taste of those early days, there's this other crazy story. The Irgun hatched this audacious plan in 1947. They decided to send letter bombs to every single senior cabinet member in London.
Wow. So they were already taking the fight directly to the British government.
Oh, yeah. And think about it. This was a relatively small underground group managing to send letter bombs all the way to London. It sent shockwaves through the British establishment.
I bet it did.
MI5, their intelligence service, they actually saw Zionist groups as the biggest threat to British security at the time, even more so than the Soviet Union. They were terrified that Prime Minister Clement Attlee might be targeted next.
That's a power move.
And it shows you how these groups, even with limited resources, they were willing to take huge risks to achieve their goals. But it also underscores that even back then, targeted killings were a double-edged sword. A tool of resistance, yes, but also a source of intense internal debate and potentially a trigger for even greater conflict.
So we've got these underground movements using targeted killings, but always with this, like, cloud hanging over it, the debate, the risks, and then, boom, everything changes.
1948, Israel becomes a nation, and with statehood
Comes a whole new set of challenges.
and opportunities. They needed a professional intelligence service, one built for the long haul.
Enter the Mossad. Straight out of the gate, they had to be ready for anything.
More than ready. We're talking about a brand new country, surrounded, let's just say, by skeptical neighbors. They had to be several steps ahead, always.
And they didn't shy away from inheriting those, shall we say, proactive tactics from the underground groups.
Let's be blunt. Targeted killing became a tool in the toolbox, but the Mossad, they aimed for, well, they wanted to perfect it.
Sophistication over chaos.
You could say that.
Yeah.
They set up these specialized units within the Mossad, each one with a specific focus.
Like what? Give us the rundown.
Well, there was Caesarea, the elite assassination squad, the best of the best, trained to a razor's edge.
Sounds intense.
They were also running the Birds. This was a joint Mossad Shin Bet operation.
Shin Bet being their internal security service.
That's the one. And these guys, they were known for being, well, let's just say direct in their approach.
Direct, meaning what exactly? Any examples of this directness in action?
Bergman digs up this story about Mir Harzayan. He was a commander in Unit 101, a special forces outfit within the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces.
So we're talking about the military, not even the intelligence agencies at this point.
Right, but this story shows how blurry those lines could get. So in 1955, Bedouins killed Harzayan's sister.
Oh, man. Talk about a personal stake in things.
Right. So what does he do? He grabs two of his buddies, allegedly gets a nod and a wink from a young Ariel Sharon, who was his commander at the time.
Hold on, Ariel Sharon, as in future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
The one and only.
Ah.
So they cross the border, and they kill 4 Bedouin shepherds in retaliation.
Okay, that's taking things into your own hands, to
Yeah.
say the least.
It was a powder keg. Moshe Sharett, the prime minister at the time, he was horrified. Saw it as a blatant act of vengeance, something that could easily spiral out of control. He demanded a court-martial.
I mean, you can't have soldiers just going rogue, right?
Okay.
Even if they'd suffered a loss.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Figures like Ben Gurion, Moshe Dayan, even Sharon himself, they protected Harzayan and his men.
Because they agreed with his actions. Or
Well-
because they saw some kind of, I don't know, strategic value in what he'd done.
It's murky. Bergman argues that this incident highlights this constant internal struggle within Israel's leadership.
Between what, exactly?
Between this deep-seated belief in their own humanity, they were building a nation after all, and the knowledge that sometimes survival means making brutal, even ruthless decisions.
That's a hell of a thing to grapple with.
Bergman actually found this diary entry from Sharett, written right around this time, where he talks about Israel grappling with these two souls.
Two souls.
He means one driven by this profound sense of justice, of wanting to do right by the world, by their history, and the other being capable of taking extreme action when they felt their very existence was on the line.
It's that whole never again mentality, right?
Exactly. And this internal struggle, that tension, it's woven into the very fabric of how they approach and continue to approach targeted killings.
So it's not just about eliminating a threat, it's about sending a message, too.
Always. And nowhere is that more apparent than in what happened in 1960, the downing of that Egyptian plane.
This is the one where they suspected high-ranking Egyptian officers were on board.
Right. Yep. And they took it down over international waters.
They shot down a civilian airliner. That seems, I don't know, incredibly risky, even for the Mossad.
Risky, sure.
Yeah.
But remember, this was the Mossad under Isser Harel. This guy was a legend, famous for his daring, his willingness to push boundaries.
That's the fallout. I can't imagine it went over well.
Globally. Condemnation, outrage, you name it. But it also showed the world that the Mossad, they were willing to play on a different chessboard altogether.
They were playing 4D chess while everyone else was still figuring out checkers.
Right. They were operating on a global scale, thinking several moves ahead, and they were willing to take risks that other countries wouldn't even consider.
And this all leads us to a turning point, both for the Mossad and for the world. 1972, the Munich Olympics.
The world watched in horror. For Israel, it was more than just an attack. It felt like a horrifying echo of their darkest fears.
How could they possibly feel safe, even at something as unifying as the Olympics?
Exactly. And Golda Meir, the prime minister, she wasn't going to let this stand. She gave the Mossad a single, crystal-clear directive: Operation Wrath of God.
So we've seen this tactic evolve from those early days, almost like a vigilante thing, to the Mossad becoming this global force, taking huge risks, sometimes making, well, devastating mistakes. But the world doesn't sit still, right? New threats emerge.
And in the 1980s, the game changed again. The Palestinian Intifada erupted. This wasn't about a far-off enemy. This was happening within Israel's own border.
It's a whole new kind of challenge for a nation used to, let's be honest, facing threats head-on. How do you target an enemy that's so well dispersed?
That's the thing about the Intifada. It was as much about ideas, about resistance, as it was about any one leader or organization.
But Israel, they still saw targeted killing as a key tool, right?
They did. But the focus shifted. Now it was about eliminating those individuals accused of orchestrating the Intifada from within the occupied territories.
So we're talking about Palestinian leaders, organizers, anyone deemed a significant threat.
Exactly. But this time, the debate about collateral damage, it became impossible to ignore.
Because now you're operating in more densely populated areas. There's just no way to guarantee, with absolute certainty, that civilians won't get caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. And Bergman talks about this one operation in 1992, the assassination of Sheikh Abbas al-Musawi.
Al-Musawi, he was the leader of Hezbollah, right?
Right. He was. And his assassination. Huge ripple effects, not just because he was a powerful figure, but because his wife and child were also killed in the operation.
Along with several others, if I remember correctly.
You do, and that's the thing. You can't talk about targeted killings without talking about the human cost, the innocent lives lost, the families torn apart.
Did Israel ever acknowledge this? Did they ever, I don't know, grapple publicly with the moral implications of these kinds of losses?
They argued and continue to argue that they take every precaution to minimize civilian harm, that these killings are only carried out after all other options have been exhausted.
And that they have this rigorous intelligence gathering process, legal review, all of that.
That's the line. The critics, they say even one civilian death is too many. That the very nature of this tactic, this idea that you can take out one person and solve a complex problem, it's flawed from the start.
It's like playing whack-a-mole with human life.
And the stakes are just too high to get it wrong. Bergman actually uncovers this incredible story from 1982. There was a plan in place to assassinate Yasser Arafat.
Arafat, we're talking about the chairman of the PLO, a hugely symbolic figure, even for those who disagreed with him. What was the plan?
Well, at the time, the Israelis believed they'd pinpointed Arafat's location. He was on a civilian airliner, and they were seriously considering shooting it down.
No way. Are you serious?
Yeah.
Shooting down a plane full of people to get to one guy, even if that guy was Arafat?
It almost happened. General Amos Gilboa, he was heading up the research division of AM, that's Israel's military intelligence agency. He caught wind of this plan and hit the roof.
He must have known how catastrophic that would be. Not just the loss of life, but the political fallout, the global outrage.
He told them, point blank, that downing a civilian airliner, even with Arafat on board, it would ruin the state internationally.
And he was right. It's a stark reminder that even within a system that often seems, I don't know, maybe even obsessed with security, there were still those voices urging restraint, urging caution.
Voices like Gilboa's, they understood that some lines you just can't cross, not without risking everything.
So they decided against shooting down the plane. But did this close call lead to any, I don't know, formal changes?
Yeah.
Did Israel ever attempt to create, like, actual guidelines or regulations around targeted killings?
It evolved, but slowly. It wasn't until the early 1990s, under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, that they implemented what became known as the Red Pages system.
Okay, so what was that all about?
The Red Pages, it was an attempt to, well, formalize the authorization process for these kinds of operations.
So before that, it was basically like, what, a handshake deal between a few guys in a smoky room?
Maybe not quite that dramatic, but you get the idea. The Red Pages meant that any targeted killing needed sign-off from the highest levels, usually the prime minister, a few key advisors.
So more checks and balances, theoretically.
You could say that. It was an attempt to, well, to create a paper trail to make sure these things weren't happening on a whim without proper oversight.
Okay, so fast forward to today. After decades of relying on this tactic, has it worked?
Worked is a loaded word.
Okay, fair enough. Has it made Israel safer?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. They've eliminated a lot of high-value targets, that's for sure. But has it solved the larger conflict, the one that's been raging for decades? Not even close.
Some would argue it's actually made things worse. That it's fueled the cycle of violence, created martyrs, stoked resentment.
It's a debate that continues to this day. And Bergman gives us this incredibly insightful and damning critique from Meir Dagan, the former head of the Mossad. He served under Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, even Benjamin Netanyahu during his first term as prime minister.
So we're talking about a guy who was literally in the room when these decisions were being made.
Exactly. And Dagan was incredibly critical of Netanyahu, especially during his later terms in office.
What was his main gripe?
He believed that Netanyahu was too quick to resort to targeted killings. Too focused on, I don't know, maybe the short-term win, the political victory, rather than focusing on a long-term strategy for peace.
So even within the Mossad, within the very organization tasked with carrying out these operations, there was disagreement, dissent.
Always. And that's what makes this topic, this whole world of targeted killing, so endlessly fascinating, so ethically complex.
It's a world of high-stakes gambles, of impossible choices, and often unintended consequences. It's a world that most of us will never see firsthand, but one that, sadly, continues to shape our world in profound ways.
Absolutely. And it's a topic that deserves our attention, our scrutiny, and yes, even our discomfort. Because if we don't grapple with these difficult questions, if we don't try to understand the forces that shape our world, then we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive into the history of targeted killings in Israel. We hope this conversation has given you a deeper and perhaps even more unsettling understanding of this complex and controversial practice. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking out those hidden truths, and most importantly, never stop questioning the world around you.